The sofa in my son Daniel's apartment had a lumpy cushion that dug into my lower back every night. For 3 weeks, I'd been trying to find a comfortable position. But no matter how I twisted, the springs poked through like a reminder of my new reality. I was 60 years old, and my life had been reduced to a corner of this cramped Chicago apartment. My clothes, my books, my entire existence, stuffed into 2 faded suitcases behind Daniel's entertainment center. I pressed my face into the rough fabric of the throw pillow, catching the sharp scent of Laura's lavender perfume mixed with the faint bitterness of Daniel's morning coffee. It was the smell of my exile. Through the thin walls, I could hear them whispering in their bedroom, their voices low and hurried. They weren't talking about work or dinner plans. They were talking about me, about how to handle me, as if I were a problem to be solved rather than the woman who'd raised Daniel, bandaged his scraped knees, and cheered at every one of his high school soccer games. At 60, I never thought I'd be here, sleeping on a fold-out sofa in my own son's living room. My marriage to Richard, 35 years of shared mornings and quiet evenings, had unraveled in a single afternoon when he told me he'd found someone new. Someone younger, he said, with a smile that still haunts me. The divorce papers were barely signed when Daniel offered me this temporary spot on his couch. Temporary, that's what he called it. As if losing my home, my partner, my entire world was just a hiccup to be fixed by spring. The morning light slipped through Laura's spotless blinds, casting soft stripes across the hardwood floor I wasn't allowed to walk on with shoes. Their home had rules, unspoken, but ironclad. Don't use the fancy coffee maker, it was Laura's wedding gift from her aunt. Don't touch the fridge without asking, they kept it stocked just so. Don't rearrange anything, not even a coaster, because Laura liked her space to look like a magazine spread. I'd become a ghost, tiptoeing around the edges of their perfect life. Daniel's alarm buzzed at 6:30 a.m., sharp as ever. I heard the creak of their bed, then the soft thud of his feet hitting the floor. Laura would be next, her 15-minute routine filling the bathroom with the scent of jasmine shampoo and expensive face cream. By the time I got my turn, the hot water would be gone. A small cruelty, maybe not intentional, but it stung all the same. "Morning, Mom," Daniel said as he appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed in his pressed slacks and button-down shirt. At 33, he had his father's broad shoulders and my quiet stubbornness, though he seemed to have forgotten where that came from. "Couldn't sleep," I murmured, stirring instant coffee in a chipped mug I'd heated in the microwave. The sleek espresso machine on the counter was off limits. Another of Laura's treasures. Daniel loosened his tie, a nervous habit he'd had since he was a boy. "Laura and I were talking," he said, his voice careful, like he was stepping around glass. "We think it's time you started looking for something more permanent." The coffee burned my tongue, but I barely noticed. "Permanent?" I repeated, the word heavy in my mouth. "You know, Mom, senior communities, they've got activities, meal plans, people your age." His eyes darted to the floor, avoiding mine. "This was always temporary, of course," I said, setting the mug down harder than I meant to. The sound echoed in the quiet kitchen. How silly of me to think I could stay until I got back on my feet. "Don't be like that," Daniel said, his voice sharper now. "We're trying to help." "Help," I echoed, the word tasting bitter. "Daniel, yesterday you drove Laura's mom to see that new condo downtown. The one with the marble floors and the rooftop garden. You didn't mention anything about senior communities for her." His jaw tightened, and I saw his Adam's apple bob. "That's different. Helen has specific needs. Her house is too big since Dad passed." "My specific need," I said slowly, "is a place to sleep that isn't your couch." Laura appeared then, her dark hair pulled into a neat ponytail, her blouse crisp for her marketing job. She moved through the kitchen with the precision of a dancer, avoiding my gaze as she filled her travel mug with coffee from the forbidden machine. "Morning, Eleanor," she said, her voice cool, deliberate. She never called me Mom. It was a small but constant reminder that I wasn't family, just a guest who'd overstayed her welcome. "Good morning, dear," I replied, forcing warmth into my tone. "Daniel was just telling me about your mother's new condo." Laura's hand paused on the coffee machine, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Mom needed a fresh start," she said, still not looking at me. That big house was too much for her alone. Of course, I said, my eyes flicking to the tiny living room where I'd spent the last 3 weeks. A big house can be overwhelming for one person. The silence stretched between us, tight as a wire. Daniel cleared his throat, breaking it. Mom, we're just trying to figure out what's best. For everyone. Best, I repeated, folding my hands in my lap to keep them from shaking. For everyone. I didn't say more. I didn't need to. The weight of their words, their rules, their pity, it pressed down on me, heavier than the lumpy sofa ever could. But somewhere beneath the hurt, a spark flickered. I wasn't sure what it was yet, anger, resolve, or something else entirely. All I knew was that I couldn't stay here, fading into the background of their lives. Not for much longer. Oh, and if you're listening to this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Have you ever felt like you didn't belong in a place that was supposed to be home? I'd love to hear your story. The next morning, I woke to the same ache in my back. The sofa's springs a cruel reminder of my place in Daniel's home. The apartment was quiet, save for the faint hum of the fridge and the occasional car passing outside. I sat up, clutching the thin blanket Laura had given me, the one that smelled faintly of mothballs. My hands shook as I reached for my chipped mug. The instant coffee gone cold hours ago. I didn't bother reheating it. What was the point? Through the wall, I heard Daniel and Laura moving about, their voices muffled but sharp with purpose. They were planning their day, their life, their future, none of which seemed to include me. I'd overheard enough of their late-night whispers to know they were tired of me being here. Tired of stepping over my suitcases. Tired of pretending I wasn't a burden. I stood, smoothing the wrinkles from my skirt, and walked to the kitchen. The linoleum was cold under my bare feet, another rule, no shoes indoors. I caught my reflection in the stainless steel fridge, a tired woman with graying hair and eyes that didn't shine like they used to. 60 years old, and I was invisible in my own son's home. Daniel appeared in the doorway, his tie already knotted, his hair neatly combed. "You're up early, Mom," he said, his tone light but guarded, like he was bracing for something. "Couldn't sleep," I said, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. I gestured toward the spare room down the hall, the one they used for storage but were planning to turn into Daniel's home office. I was wondering, maybe I could sleep in there, just for a night or two. The sofa's been hard on my back. Daniel's face tightened, and he glanced toward the hallway as if Laura might appear to save him from this conversation. "Mom, that room's not really set up for sleeping. We need it for work stuff. You know, with my new promotion, I'm doing more from home." I nodded slowly, trying to keep my face neutral. "Of course, work comes first." Laura swept into the kitchen then, her heels clicking softly despite the no-shoes rule. She was dressed for her marketing job, her makeup flawless, her dark hair pulled into a sleek bun. She didn't look at me as she opened the fridge, pulling out a yogurt and a bottle of kombucha. "Morning, Eleanor," she said, her voice clipped, like my name was a formality she'd rather skip. "Good morning, dear," I replied, forcing a smile. I was just asking Daniel about the spare room. My back's been acting up, and I thought a real bed might help. Just for a night. Laura's hand paused on the fridge door, her shoulders stiffening. She turned, her green eyes cool and assessing. "Eleanor, that room's for Daniel's office. It's not really appropriate for guests." The word landed like a slap. Guests, not family, not Mom, just a guest who'd worn out her welcome. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "I understand," I said, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. "I just thought, with the baby coming, you might need that space soon anyway." They were expecting their first child in 5 months, and the spare room was already half cleared for a nursery. I'd seen the paint swatches on the counter, soft blues and greens, and the catalog for cribs Laura had left open on the coffee table. "Exactly," Laura said, her tone sharp now. "That's why we need to keep it clear. For the baby, for our family, our family." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I wasn't part of that, I was the outsider, the inconvenience, the woman who'd raised Daniel but was now just a problem to be solved. "Mom," Daniel cut in, his voice softer but no less firm. "We're trying to be reasonable here. You can't expect us to rearrange our whole life because? He trailed off, but I knew what he wanted to say. Because you're here. Because you're in the way. Because my marriage fell apart? I finished for him, my voice low but steady. Because your father decided 35 years wasn't enough and traded me in for someone half my age? Daniel's face flushed, and he looked away, his fingers tugging at his tie again. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? I pressed, stepping closer. Because yesterday, you drove Laura's mom to see that new condo downtown. The one with the marble floors and the view of the lake. You didn't tell her to look at senior communities. You didn't tell her she was a burden. Laura set her yogurt down with a sharp clink. Eleanor, my mother's situation is different. She's alone now, and that house was too much for her. We're just helping her find something that works. Alone, I repeated, the word bitter on my tongue. And what am I, Laura? I'm alone too. My home is gone. My savings are frozen while the lawyers argue over who gets what from a marriage that meant nothing to your father in the end. But I guess my kind of alone doesn't count. The kitchen went silent, the only sound the faint drip of the coffee maker Laura had forgotten to turn off. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again, like a fish gasping for air. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Mom, if you wanted comfort, you should have stayed married to Dad. The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at my son, this boy I'd carried, raised, loved through every fever, every heartbreak, every triumph. 33 years, and he'd reduced my entire life, my pain, my loss, to a single cruel sentence. I set my mug in the sink, my hands trembling but careful. Deliberate. Thank you, Daniel, I said, my voice calm in a way that surprised even me. Thank you for making it clear where I stand. Mom, I didn't mean, he started. But I was already walking away. Back to the sofa, back to my suitcases, back to the weight of my shame. Behind me, I heard Laura murmur something about tough love and not enabling. The words followed me like a shadow, clinging to my skin. That day, I sat on the sofa, my phone in hand, scrolling through rental listings I couldn't afford. My savings, $1.200, scraped together from years of pinching pennies as a teacher, might cover a deposit. Maybe a month's rent if I was lucky. But at 60, with no job, no credit in my own name, it felt like I was staring into a void. I thought about Daniel's words, replaying them over and over. If you wanted comfort, you should have stayed married. They burned, not just because they were cruel, but because they came from my son. My boy, the one I'd taught to tie his shoes, to stand up to bullies, to believe in himself, and now, he believed I was nothing more than a mistake to be fixed. But somewhere, deep inside, that spark I'd felt yesterday flickered again. It wasn't just anger, it was something stronger, something that whispered I wasn't done yet. I didn't know how, but I knew I couldn't stay here, fading into their lives like a stain they wished they could scrub out. The days after Daniel's words felt like wading through fog. His voice echoed in my head, sharp and unyielding. If you wanted comfort, you should have stayed married. I carried that hurt with me, a weight heavier than the suitcases tucked behind the entertainment center. But something else was stirring too, a stubborn spark, faint but persistent, refusing to let me sink completely. One gray afternoon, I sat on the sofa, my phone balanced on my knee, scrolling through job listings I wasn't qualified for and apartments I couldn't afford. My savings, $1.200, pieced together from years of stretching my teacher's pension, felt like a cruel joke. Then, almost by accident, I stumbled across an email buried in my inbox. It was from a national memoir contest I'd entered months ago, back when I still had a home, a husband, a life that made sense. I'd written the piece late one night, pouring my heart onto the page. 35 years of marriage. The quiet joys, the unspoken compromises, and the shattering moment when Richard told me he was leaving. I'd sent it off without much hope. A fleeting nod to the girl I'd been at 20, dreaming of becoming a writer before life steered me toward teaching and motherhood. I'd forgotten about it until now. The email's subject line was simple: congratulations, Eleanor Brooks. My heart stuttered. I opened it, my fingers clumsy on the screen. We are thrilled to inform you that your memoir, A Life Unraveled, has won the 2025 National Memoir Prize. Your prize of $2.5 million will be processed upon verification. I read it again, and again. $2.5 million. After taxes, maybe $1.5 million. More money than I'd ever imagined having. More than Richard and I had saved in all our years together. More than Daniel would see in a decade of his HR job. I sat there, staring at the screen, the words blurring as my hands began to tremble. The apartment was quiet, Daniel and Laura both at work. I stood and walked to the window. The Chicago skyline hazy in the distance. The city felt like it belonged to someone else's life now. This money, this impossible, life-changing money, was mine. A door had opened, and for the first time in weeks, I could see a path forward. But I didn't tell anyone. Not Daniel, not Laura, not even the neighbor who nodded politely when I passed her in the hallway. I signed the back of the contest confirmation letter, tucked it into my purse next to my expired library card, and kept my secret close. To them, I was still Eleanor, the broken woman on their sofa, the mother who'd made bad choices and ended up homeless. Let them think that. For now, that evening, I borrowed Daniel's old laptop, another thing I had to ask permission to use, and started researching. I hadn't done anything like this in years. But teaching had taught me how to plan, how to organize, how to dream with purpose. I pulled up real estate listings, focusing on properties outside the city, places where the air was clean and the sky felt wide. Illinois had farmland, small towns, spaces where a woman like me could start over. I found it on the third night of searching, a 30-acre plot in rural Illinois. Just 2 hours from Chicago. A small farmhouse, a barn, and a patch of land perfect for growing flowers. The listing mentioned wild lavender already sprouting along the edges. Neglected but stubborn, like me. The price was $280, well within my reach. I could see it in my mind, rows of sunflowers, daisies, lavender, a place where beauty could grow from nothing, a place where I could build something new. I thought about my old life, the one I'd lost. Teaching had been my calling, but writing had been my first love, back when I was young and thought the world would wait for me. The memoir contest had reminded me of that girl, the one who believed her words could matter. Maybe this farm could be more than a home. Maybe it could be a sanctuary, not just for me, but for others, women like me, who'd lost their way and needed a place to remember who they were. I started sketching plans in a notebook I'd bought for $1 at the corner store. A flower farm, yes, but also workshops, writing classes for women my age, a space to share their stories, to heal through words. I'd call it Lavender Haven. The name felt right, like a promise to myself. Daniel and Laura didn't notice the change in me. I kept my head down, folding the blanket each morning, keeping my corner of their living room tidy. But inside, I was alive in a way I hadn't been in years. I contacted the contest organizers, confirmed the prize, and learned the first payment would hit my account within days. I opened a new bank account, one Richard didn't know about, one that was mine alone. One night, as I sat on the sofa, pretending to read a library book, Laura walked by, her eyes skimming over me like I was part of the furniture. "You okay, Eleanor?" she asked, her tone more obligation than concern. "Fine, dear," I said, smiling faintly, just thinking about the future. She raised an eyebrow but didn't press. She didn't need to know that my future was already taking shape. That the woman she'd dismissed as a burden was about to become someone she couldn't ignore. I closed my eyes, picturing the lavender fields, the farmhouse with its sagging porch, the life I was going to build. Daniel's words still stung. "If you wanted comfort, you should have stayed married," but they didn't define me anymore. This money, this chance, it was mine, and I was going to use it to rewrite my story, page by page. The moment the first payment from the memoir contest hit my account, I felt a weight lift, not just from my shoulders, but from my soul. $1.5 million after taxes. Numbers that didn't seem real. Yet there they were, glowing on my bank app as I sat on Daniel's lumpy sofa. I didn't tell him or Laura. I didn't tell anyone. I packed my 2 suitcases, left a note thanking them for their hospitality, and drove away in the old Honda Daniel had let me borrow. No goodbye, no explanation. They didn't deserve one. 2 weeks later, I stood on the porch of my new home, a weathered farmhouse on 30 acres of Illinois farmland. Surrounded by wild lavender and patches of stubborn daisies, the air smelled of earth and possibility. So different from the sterile lavender perfume of Laura's apartment. The real estate agent, a kind woman named Margaret with a habit of talking too fast, handed me the keys with a smile. "Welcome to your fresh start, Ms. Brooks." A fresh start. At 60, those words felt like a gift I hadn't expected to unwrap. I walked through the farmhouse, my footsteps echoing on the creaky hardwood floors. The kitchen was outdated, with faded yellow cabinets and a stove that looked older than me. The living room had a stone fireplace, cold now but waiting to be lit. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms offered space for dreams I hadn't dared to dream in years. This wasn't just a house. It was a canvas, a place to paint the life I'd been too afraid to imagine. I named it Lavender Haven. The name came to me that first night as I sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the fields gold. I wasn't just going to grow flowers here, sunflowers, lavender, clematis. I was going to build something more. A sanctuary for women like me. Women who'd lost their way and needed a place to find their voice again. I'd host writing workshops, spaces where they could share their stories, their pain, their triumphs. I'd turn my own heartbreak into something beautiful, something that could heal others too. The first person I hired was Sophie, a 25-year-old barista I'd met at the coffee shop in town. She'd overheard me talking to Margaret about my plans and shyly mentioned she'd always wanted to write. Her eyes lit up when she talked about poetry, about the stories she carried but never had the chance to tell. "I don't have much experience," she'd said, twisting her apron in her hands. "But I'm a quick learner." I didn't need experience. I needed heart. Sophie had that in spades. I offered her a job helping with the farm and the workshops, plus a room in the farmhouse in exchange for her work. She moved in the next day, her belongings fitting into a single duffel bag. "This place feels like home already," she said, standing in the kitchen with a grin that reminded me of the girl I'd been at her age. Sophie and I spent those first weeks transforming Lavender Haven. We planted rows of flowers, their roots sinking deep into the rich Illinois soil. We fixed the barn, turning it into a workshop space with long tables and windows that let in the morning light. I hired contractors to update the plumbing, repair the roof, and install a new fence for the flower fields. Every decision felt like a reclaiming of myself, a reminder that I wasn't the broken woman Daniel and Laura thought I was. The workshops started small. 5 women, all over 50, showed up to the first one, clutching notebooks and stories they'd never told anyone. I shared my own, my marriage, my divorce, the sofa that had been my temporary prison. They listened, nodded, cried. Then they wrote stories of lost loves, estranged children, dreams buried under years of sacrifice. The room filled with their words, their laughter, their tears. For the first time in months, I felt whole. Sophie became more than an employee. She became the daughter I'd always wanted, not in place of Daniel, but in addition to him. She'd sit with me on the porch after a long day, sipping tea and talking about her dreams of publishing a poetry collection. "You're doing something amazing here, Eleanor," she said one evening, her voice soft against the hum of crickets. "You're giving people a place to start over." I smiled, my heart full in a way it hadn't been in years. "We're all starting over, Sophie. That's what this place is for." Meanwhile, I cut Daniel out of my life. His calls started a week after I left. The first voicemail was casual, "Mom. Just checking in. Where are you?" The second was sharper, "Mom. We're worried. Call me back." By the third, his voice cracked with something like guilt, "Mom. Please, just let me know you're okay." I didn't call back, not because I wanted to hurt him, but because I needed space to build something that was mine. Daniel had made his choice when he told me I should have stayed married for comfort. Now I was making mine. The farm grew, and so did I. I learned how to care for lavender, how to prune sunflowers, how to coax life from soil that had been neglected for years. Sophie taught me how to use social media to promote the workshops. And soon we had a waiting list. Women from Chicago, from Springfield, even from out of state, started signing up. They came to write, to heal, to find themselves. And I was there, guiding them, not as the teacher I'd been for 30 years, but as someone who'd walked through the fire and come out stronger. One evening, as I sat at the kitchen table reviewing workshop registrations, Sophie burst in, her cheeks flushed. "Eleanor, you've got to see this." She held up her phone, showing a local news article about Lavender Haven. "They're calling you the Flower Lady of Illinois," she said, laughing. "They say you're changing lives out here." I read the article, my heart swelling. The photo showed me standing in the lavender fields, my gray hair loose in the wind, a smile I hadn't seen on my own face in years. This was who I was now, not the woman on Daniel's sofa. Not the wife Richard had discarded, but Eleanor Brooks, the woman who'd turned her pain into purpose. But even as I stood in my new life, Daniel's words lingered in the back of my mind. "If you wanted comfort, you should have stayed married." They didn't hurt as much anymore, but they were a reminder of what I'd left behind, and what I still had to face. I didn't know when or how, but I knew my son and I weren't done yet. Not by a long shot. 4 months after I left Daniel's apartment, Lavender Haven was thriving. The fields bloomed with rows of lavender and sunflowers, their colors so vivid they seemed to hum under the Illinois sky. The workshops were fully booked, with women driving hours to sit at our tables, their notebooks open, their stories spilling out. Sophie and I worked side by side, planting, pruning, planning. My life felt full, purposeful, like I'd finally found the place I was meant to be. But some nights, as I sat on the farmhouse porch with a mug of tea, Daniel's words crept back. "If you wanted comfort, you should have stayed married." They didn't sting as much anymore, but they were a reminder of unfinished business. I hadn't spoken to him since I left. His voicemails had stopped after the first month, and I'd heard through a mutual friend that he and Laura were managing. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need to. Then, one crisp October morning, I saw a familiar silver sedan struggling up the gravel drive to the farm. Dust swirled around its tires as it parked near the barn. I was in the lavender field, clipping stems for a workshop bouquet, when I recognized it, Daniel's car. The one he'd grudgingly let me use for job interviews that never materialized. My heart tightened, but I kept my hands steady, the shears slicing through the stalks with a soft snip. Sophie glanced up from the flower bed nearby, her brow furrowed. "You expecting company, Eleanor?" I shook my head, my eyes fixed on the car. "Not exactly." Daniel stepped out first, his suit jacket wrinkled, his hair messier than I'd ever seen it. Laura followed, her pregnancy now visible at 7 months. Her usual polished look frayed at the edges, her blouse untucked, her face bare of makeup. They looked like people who'd been running on fumes. And I knew, without them saying a word, that something had gone wrong. I set down my shears and walked toward the fence, my boots crunching on the gravel. Sophie followed at a distance, her curiosity barely hidden. Daniel spotted me and froze, his hands shoved into his pockets. "Mom," he called, his voice uncertain, smaller than I remembered. "Can we talk?" I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch, let him feel the weight of it. "Hello, Daniel," I said finally, stopping at the fence. "Laura, what brings you here?" Laura's eyes darted around the farm, taking in the blooming fields, the barn turned workshop, the farmhouse that stood proud despite its peeling paint. "Eleanor," she said, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. We need your help." I raised an eyebrow, folding my arms. "Help?" Daniel cleared his throat, stepping closer to the fence. "Things haven't been great. The company restructured, and I got laid off. Laura's on maternity leave, and we couldn't keep up with the rent. The landlord called the lease. We've got nowhere to go." I looked at them, my son. Who'd once told me I wasn't worth a bed in his home, his wife? Who'd called me Eleanor like it was a curse? Now they stood before me, desperate, their lives unraveling just as mine had. "Nowhere to go," I repeated, my voice calm but deliberate. "That must be hard." Laura's face flushed, but she held my gaze. "We know this is a lot to ask. But your family, we thought maybe you could let us stay here, just until we get back on our feet." Family. The word hung in the air, sharp and ironic. I let it linger, my eyes moving from Daniel's tired face to Laura's nervous hands, resting on her belly. "Come with me," I said, turning toward the small caretaker's cottage near the barn. "Let's see what we can do." The cottage was basic, built for farmhands decades ago. A tiny living room with a sagging couch. A kitchen with chipped counters and a temperamental stove. 2 small bedrooms barely big enough for a bed. Sophie had used it for storage. But I'd had it cleaned out. As if I'd known this day might come. I opened the door, gesturing for them to step inside. "It's cozy," Laura said, her voice faltering as she took in the cracked linoleum and the single bulb flickering overhead. "It's shelter," I said, my tone even. "Running water, electricity, a roof. More than some people have." I opened a cabinet, revealing a stack of mismatched plates and a few dented pots. "You'll have the bedrooms to yourselves. Sophie's moving her things to the main house today." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Thanks, Mom. We appreciate it." "Oh, we're not done," I said, leaning against the counter. "There are rules. This is a working farm. We start at 5 a.m., feeding, pruning, prepping for workshops. No loud noises after 8 p.m., the guests need quiet. No visitors without my approval. And everyone works. No exceptions." Laura's eyes widened. "Eleanor, I'm 7 months pregnant. I can't be hauling flower buckets or whatever you do out here. Then Daniel will work twice as hard to cover for you," I said, meeting her gaze, "unless you'd prefer to find another place to stay." Daniel's face paled, and he glanced at Laura, who looked like she might cry. "We'll make it work," he said quickly. "We're grateful, Mom. Really, grateful," I repeated, letting the word hang between us. I turned to Daniel, my voice dropping low. "Do you remember when you were 10? And you wanted that new bike? I told you to earn half the money yourself. You shoveled snow all winter. Saved every penny. You learned what things cost." His brow furrowed. "What's that got to do with this?" "Everything," I said, stepping closer. 4 months ago, you told me I should have stayed married if I wanted comfort. You let me sleep on your sofa, Daniel, while you drove Laura's mother to see condos with lake views. You made me feel like nothing. Now you're here, asking for my help. So tell me, what's it like to need a place to sleep and have nowhere else to turn?" His mouth opened, then closed. Laura looked away, her hands clutching her purse. "Mom," Daniel said finally, his voice breaking, "I was wrong. I was frustrated, and I said things I shouldn't have. I'm sorry." I studied him, searching for the boy I'd raised. The one who'd once hugged me so tight he left jelly stains on my shirt. But all I saw was a man who'd learned too late what his words could cost. "Sorry's a start," I said, my voice steady, "but actions matter more. You'll have plenty of time to prove you mean it." I turned to leave, pausing at the door. "Sophie will show you the routine tomorrow. Feeding, cleaning, helping with the workshops. It's honest work, good for the soul." As I walked back to the farmhouse, I heard Laura's muffled sob through the cottage window. Part of me, the part that still loved my son, wanted to turn back. To make this easier, but I kept walking. They needed to feel what I'd felt. They needed to learn what comfort really cost. 4 months after Daniel and Laura moved into the caretaker's cottage, Lavender Haven felt like a different world. The fields bloomed brighter, with rows of lavender swaying in the breeze and sunflowers turning their faces to the sky. The workshops had grown, drawing women from across the Midwest, their voices filling the barn with stories of loss and resilience. I'd built something real here, something that mattered, but what surprised me most wasn't the farm or the workshops, it was the change in my son. Daniel had started those first weeks with resentment. His shoulders hunched as he hauled buckets of compost or swept the barn floor. Laura, too, had struggled, her manicured hands clumsy with pruning shears, her complaints sharp until she realized no one was listening. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, they began to shift. Daniel's movements grew steadier, his soft office hands now calloused from work. Laura started helping with the workshop schedules, her marketing skills finding a new purpose in organizing our growing waitlist. One chilly February morning, I stood in the kitchen, my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, the good kind. Ground fresh, not the instant sludge I'd survived on in Daniel's apartment. Through the window, I saw Daniel in the field, carefully tying back lavender stalks to protect them from an early frost. His face was different now, less hurried, more thoughtful, like a man who'd learned to listen to the rhythm of the earth. Sophie joined me, cradling a steaming mug of her own. "He's getting good at that," she said, nodding toward Daniel. Yesterday, he asked if we could expand the flower beds. Said he's been reading about companion planting. Can you believe it? I smiled, a warmth spreading through me. He's always been a quick study. Just needed the right teacher. The right teacher, in this case, was life itself. The cottage, with its creaky floors and drafty windows, had been their classroom. They'd learned what it meant to live simply, to work for every meal, every night's sleep. They'd learned what I'd felt on their sofa, vulnerable, dependent, at the mercy of someone else's rules. That afternoon, Laura knocked on the farmhouse door, a manila folder tucked under her arm. Her hair was pulled into a messy braid, her face free of makeup, her pregnancy now in its final weeks. She looked different, softer somehow, like the sharp edges of her old self had worn away. Eleanor, she said, her voice hesitant. Can we talk? I gestured to the kitchen table. Sit. She set the folder down, her hands trembling slightly. I've been working on the farm's books, she said, opening the folder to reveal neat spreadsheets, her handwriting precise in the margins. The workshops are breaking even, and the flower sales are up 20% this month. I found some ways to cut costs, better suppliers, bulk orders, and, she pulled out another sheet. There's a grant we could apply for. It could fund a second barn, maybe even a community garden. I studied the papers, impressed despite myself. Laura had taken my scattered receipts and turned them into a plan. A vision for Lavender Haven's future. This is good work, I said, meeting her eyes. Really good. Her shoulders relaxed, and for the first time, I saw something like hope in her face. Eleanor, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I know why we're here. I know what this has been about. And I know we deserved it. I leaned back in my chair, waiting. Sophie slipped out quietly, giving us space, though I caught her curious glance from the doorway. Daniel and I have talked, Laura continued, about how we treated you, about the sofa, the rules, the way we made you feel like you didn't matter. We were wrong. I was wrong. She swallowed hard, her eyes glistening. I want to be better. For our baby. For you. I studied her, searching for the woman who'd called me Eleanor like it was a wall between us. She wasn't there anymore. In her place was someone new, someone who'd learned what it meant to lose everything and still keep going. Those are nice words, Laura, I said, my voice steady. But words are easy. Actions are what count. I know, she said, nodding quickly. She pushed the folder toward me. That's why we did this. Inside was a contract, drawn up by a local lawyer. It outlined their offer to work full-time at Lavender Haven, Daniel managing the fields, Laura handling the books, in exchange for staying in the cottage. No rent, just a modest salary. It was professional, thorough, a promise to earn their place. There's something else, Laura said, her voice softer now. Daniel doesn't know I'm telling you this. Every night, when he puts the baby's crib together, he talks about you. He tells the baby, our little Emma, who's coming any day now, how strong her grandmother is, how you built this place from nothing, how you never gave up, even when we made you feel like you should. My throat tightened, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. I thought of Daniel as a boy, his small hand in mine, his laughter filling our old house. I'd lost that boy somewhere along the way. But maybe, just maybe, he was finding his way back. Why? I asked finally. Why the contract? Why stay? Laura's eyes filled with tears, but her voice held steady. Because you gave us a chance to be better. Not just a roof, but a way to learn what family really means. We want to be part of this, Eleanor, not because we have to, but because we want to deserve it. I looked out the window, where Daniel was stacking flower crates, his movements sure and deliberate. The man who'd once flinched at dirt now worked with a quiet pride I hadn't seen in years. I turned back to Laura. The cottage is yours, I said, not as a gift, but as something you've earned. But hear me clearly, if you ever make me feel invisible again, if you ever take my love for granted, this ends. No second chances. Understood? Understood, she said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. And Daniel, he's ready to apologize. He's just waiting for you to be ready to hear it. I stood, walking to the window. Daniel looked up from the crates. Catching my eye, he raised a hand, a tentative wave, and for the first time in months, I saw my son, not the man who'd hurt me, but the one who was trying to be better. I didn't wave back, but I nodded, just enough to let him know I saw him. As Laura gathered her papers and headed back to the cottage, I stood on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the lavender fields. The air was cool, carrying the faint sweetness of the flowers. This place, this life, was mine, but it wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the women who came to write, the flowers that bloomed against the odds, and the son who was learning, slowly, what it meant to be family. Here's the lesson I've learned. One I hope you'll carry with you. Family isn't just blood, it's the people who show up when you're at your lowest. Who respect your heart even when it's bruised. Sometimes, those people hurt you. Sometimes, they need to learn what you're worth. And sometimes, the greatest act of love is holding them accountable, giving them a chance to grow, but never letting them forget the cost of your trust. If this story touched you, share it in the comments. Tell me about a time you found healing in a broken family, or how you rebuilt your life when the world told you to give up. Your story matters, just like mine.